According to the Federal Reserve, the top 1% now control as much wealth as the bottom 90% combined, all while 3/4 of Americans cannot even afford the median price home, and with nearly half of all full-time workers earning less than a living wage. It raises the question, when did exploiting the working class become the nation's business plan? Well, American capitalism has long been sold as the foundation of freedom and economic prosperity, with a belief so strong that generations of young Americans have continuously been sent to war in its supposed defense. The reality is that whatever corrupt economic system we have today could not be further from what was originally intended. Throughout the consumer revolution of the 1700s, society shifted from arresting women for wearing items deemed symbols of moral degradation, such as a cotton neckerchief, to a world where virtue was increasingly expressed through jeweled tobacco boxes, towering wigs, and extravagant fashion. One of the most influential voices to emerge during the shift was Bernard Mandeville, whose 1714 work, The Fable of the Bees, challenged centuries of religious and cultural norms that defined virtue through modesty and discipline, suggesting instead that consumption, vanity, indulgence, and even greed were not moral failures, but essential ingredients for national growth. He even argued that a frugal, honest, modest society would collapse economically, as the spendthrift, vain, and criminal kept everyone employed. Adam Smith, on the other hand, widely regarded as the father of capitalism, entered this debate with a radically different vision of what a prosperous society should look like. In his 1759 work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith argued that prosperity could never be rooted in greed or selfish indulgence, describing such systems as a cruel deception in which a poor man's son spends his entire life chasing the palaces and jewels of the wealthy, only to discover that they provide no real happiness, as nature never required such extravagance for human fulfillment. 17 years later, in The Wealth of Nations, Smith laid the groundwork for the capitalistic model, arguing that a commercial society based on private property, free markets, and the division of labor would make ordinary people vastly richer than any previous system, but only if governments and society actively restrained the rich, the powerful, and the monopolists who will otherwise capture and ruin it. He warned that people of the same trade seldom meet together, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public, insisting that merchants and manufacturers, when they were able to collude or gain legal privileges, were often the natural enemies of the common good. Smith believed joint stock companies, or what we now call public corporations, were prone to negligence, irresponsibility, and self-dealing, and should only exist for narrow public purpose projects and under strict oversight, arguing that high wages were the true measure of a flourishing nation, while supporting openly progressive taxation and condemning rentier wealth as the most unjust form of income, criticizing landlords who reap what they never sowed. And while Adam Smith was certainly not a saint, The Wealth of Nations became one of the most influential texts in early American political thought, as Jefferson and Madison saw Smith's ideas as a blueprint for broad prosperity and fair competition. But as we all know, this was not the economic reality that Americans faced. In his 1791 report, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton explicitly praised employing children, who would otherwise be idle, to serve as a source of cheap labor, ultimately laying the groundwork for a labor system that would fundamentally prioritize cheap productivity over the very people making it possible. As America moved into the Industrial Revolution, the absence of meaningful government or social protections allowed employers to push productivity into the very abuses Adam Smith warned against. Breaks were reduced, meal periods were eliminated, and factory clocks were even manipulated to extend hours without additional pay, resulting in an average 6-day work week, with some industries routinely exceeding 100 hours a week. By the time America entered the Gilded Age, business leaders insisted that the demands of the modern economy could never be met while honoring what they dismissed as the irrational expectations of newly formed labor unions, reframing calls to end low pay and harsh working conditions not as moral imperatives, but as dangerous communistic propaganda threatening economic progress. Jay Gould, one of the era's most notorious robber barons, even boasted that he could hire one half of the working class to kill the other half. In the fight against child labor, the chairman of the National Association of Manufacturers dismissed reform efforts as a labor union plot against the advancement and the happiness of the American boy, arguing that restrictions would undermine industrial prosperity. Critics even claimed that most children were destined for factory work anyway, insisting that banning child labor would rob them of the chance to develop good industrial habits. And working-class parents, trapped in a system of wages so low they could barely survive, found themselves defending child labor out of economic desperation, as their families became dependent on their children's income, forcing working-class families to continuously rely on the very system that was exploiting them, a cycle that remains embedded in American life today. However, in 1914, Henry Ford recognized that a workforce unable to afford the very products it built, or the time to enjoy them, was a threat to both business and economic growth, where he introduced one of the most consequential labor reforms in modern history, a standardized 8-hour workday, 6 days a week, paired with a wage of $5 a day, or more than double the industry standard, and roughly $158 when adjusted for inflation. Today, nearly 30% of the entire American workforce still makes less than a Ford factory worker did in 1914. Where within 24 hours, 10,000 workers lined up outside Ford's factories, forcing other companies to adopt similar policies and demonstrating what a capitalistic economy could produce when workers were treated as participants in prosperity instead of disposable units. To accelerate this vision, Ford announced in 1916 that he would stop issuing special dividends to shareholders and instead reinvest profits into building the largest automobile plant in the world. My ambition is to employ still more men, he said, to spread the benefits of this industrial system to the greatest possible number, to help them build up their lives and their homes. And while his true motives remain debated, his commitment to reinvesting in workers quickly put him at odds with his own investors, whom he viewed as parasitic entities, demanding returns while contributing nothing to production, where that conflict culminated in the 1919 Dodge vs. Ford Motor Company case, where the Michigan Supreme Court ruled that Ford's plans to use company profits to expand operations, raise wages, and lower prices was legally secondary to maximizing investor returns. Now, one of the most overlooked and propagandized aspects of this entire case is that it's not actually federal law for a corporation to operate primarily in the best interest of its shareholders. This ruling only applies in Michigan. However, this still set a legal and ideological blueprint that would eventually redefine capitalistic priorities throughout the nation. By the time the United States entered the Great Depression, mass youth unemployment had become so severe that journalist John Chamberlain warned that it was reshaping an entire generation's political and economic identity. In a 1936 survey of more than 13,000 young Americans, most expressed deep cynicism towards democratic institutions and growing support for government control over wages, labor, and financial relief. Chamberlain feared that the prolonged stagnation was creating a resentful generation, writing young people have no memory of a good economy with plentiful opportunities. They are a trapped generation that will explode, and the fascist explosion will come, as it came in Italy and Germany, regardless of education. He illustrated this volatility through the story of Joe Carnes, a young office boy who once identified as communist, convinced this economic system is never going to spread out enough to take us all in, yet abandoned politics entirely after a modest promotion. To Chamberlain, it proved that ideology was rarely the problem. Opportunity was, and without vocational training, night schools, and real job pipelines, he argued, education is a weak bulwark for democracy if democracy can't deliver the goods in the form of jobs, a future, or just plain hope, almost perfectly mirroring the reality that young Americans face today. But in 1941, America's youth was called to action as the United States entered World War II. Over the next 4 years, the economy shifted into full-scale mobilization, creating more than 17 million jobs and driving unemployment down to just 1.2%. Major corporations converted to weapons manufacturing, small businesses became military suppliers, and wages surged by nearly 65% as companies expanded benefits like health insurance and pension plans. And as America emerged as a global manufacturing powerhouse, alongside FDR's New Deal programs, American capitalism had fundamentally transformed the working class. By 1950, a minimum wage worker earning 75 cents an hour, or around $10.24 today, could afford an entire month's rent with less than a week and a half of full-time work. By 1956, when the wage reached $1, or about $11.77 today, it was enough to support a 2-person household above the poverty line. And these gains weren't driven by wages alone. Corporate tax rates were more than twice what they are today, while the top marginal tax rate climbed as high as 94%. And even though few paid the full amount, the effective burden on the wealthy was still more than double what it is today. And to ensure these gains weren't just temporary boosts, but structural benefits shared across the working class, union membership surged to nearly 35% of the entire workforce, allowing the nation to shift from a renting culture, with roughly 60% of households renting before the war, to one built on ownership, with 62% of Americans owning their homes by 1960, where this unprecedented support from both industry and federal policy allowed the same teenagers who once criticized capitalism during the Great Depression to become parents during the strongest middle class in American history, and what we now define as the golden age of American capitalism. However, as the post-war economic expansion began to stagnate, dragged down by a nation that had gorged itself on endless wars and catastrophic currency debasement, rather than accepting responsibility, political and corporate leaders shifted the blame onto the working man's so-called extravagant wage demands, casting organized labor as the driving force behind inflation, resulting in a growing societal stigma that has reduced union membership to just 10% today. Whereas in this environment that economist Milton Friedman published The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits, where in it he claimed, the businessmen believe that they are defending free enterprise when they declaim that business is not concerned merely with profit, but also with promoting desirable social ends, that business has a social conscience and takes seriously its responsibilities for providing employment, eliminating discrimination, and whatever else may be the catchwords of the contemporary crop of reformers. In fact, they are, or would be if anyone else took them seriously, preaching pure and unadulterated socialism. Businessmen who talk this way are unwitting puppets of the intellectual forces that have been undermining the basis of a free society these past decades. Once again, just completely ignoring what Adam Smith was saying and establishing the societal narrative that there is not a single thing on God's green earth that is more important than the depths of shareholders' pockets. Where within a year, corporate attorney Lewis Powell delivered the Powell Memorandum, a confidential blueprint warning business leaders that the American economic system was under attack by bright young men on college campuses being taught to distrust or even despise capitalistic principles. Powell urged corporations to launch a coordinated counteroffensive to build think tanks capable of manufacturing pro-business research, to fund media outlets that could shape public opinion, to expand corporate lobbying offices in Washington, and to embed corporate interests directly into the nation's legal and educational institutions, where by the late 1970s, corporate lobbying offices had exploded from just over 100 to more than 500, with nearly 2,500 corporations registering lobbyists by 1982. And business-backed think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, and the Cato Institute became fixtures in national policy debates. In fact, while prepping this video, I noticed how the Adam Smith Institute blatantly misrepresented a quote from The Wealth of Nations, and then discovered that it has been run by a neoliberal think tank since the late 1970s, turning Adam Smith's work into the monopolistic form of corporatism that we have today. But it wasn't until, say it with me, Ronald Reagan, that the full corporate counteroffensive Friedman and Powell envisioned was cemented into federal policy. Reagan entered office promising to get the government off the backs of the American people. But in practice, this meant removing nearly every single guardrail that had once protected workers from corporate excess. He slashed the top marginal tax rate from 70% to 28%, dismantling the progressive tax structure that had funded the post-war middle class. He fired more than 11,000 striking air traffic controllers in 1981, sending a national signal that breaking unions could no longer be a crime, but a business strategy. He deregulated the financial sector, telecommunications, transportation, and energy, clearing the path for the corporate consolidation that would come to define the next 40 years. And under the banner of free trade, him and his successors embraced a global economic model that encouraged corporations to move production overseas in pursuit of cheaper labor, where by the 1990s and early 2000s, NAFTA and the normalization of trade with China accelerated the exodus of American industry, allowing corporations to claim record profits, while communities that had once powered the nation fell into economic decay. And when the housing bubble burst in 2008, triggered by the same deregulated financial systems that Powell and Friedman fought for, the federal government stepped in, but not to rescue the homeowners, but to bail out the very institutions whose speculation caused the collapse, where the banks that engineered toxic mortgages were handed hundreds of billions of dollars in taxpayer funds, while 9 million American families lost their homes. And today, after decades of deregulation, wage suppression, union breaking, outsourcing, and financialization, American capitalism has devolved into a system where wealth is extracted rather than created, where monopolies dictate prices, and where workers generate record profits, while homelessness has surged by 30%, and childhood poverty has nearly doubled just since 2022, where the same economy that once promised upward mobility now imposes record housing costs, generational debt, stagnant wages, and a labor market where stability has been replaced by gig work, contract labor, and corporate consolidation. And with the AI boom concentrating extraordinary power into the hands of a few corporations, while exposing millions of workers to yet another speculative bubble, any collapse would become one of the largest transfers of working class wealth in American history. And while I was originally going to conclude this video by going into great detail about how I would make a change in some of these leadership positions, such as being the CEO of a large corporation, by instituting profit sharing, by getting rid of the 401k, which I personally believe is one of the most garbage financial products ever created, and going back to employer-funded pension plans or of something of that nature. I would also get rid of the 40-hour work week. I would go to some sort of 30-hour, 32-hour, and also pay for commute time. And I would do this because just like what Henry Ford did, it forces your competitors to have to do the same thing. And that's what we need. We need one honest CEO, if that even exists, to try to actually do something for the betterment of the workers and society as a whole. If I was in a leadership position of the government, I would really try to reignite union participation. I would also do everything in my power to show all of the many reasons why stock buybacks are a horrible thing for our nation and try to pass some sort of law to get rid of that. I would also be pushing for a higher tax rate for the ultra rich and for the corporations. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to tax them to oblivion. I understand the ramifications of all of that. However, it is not right for the richest people on earth to be paying a lower effective tax rate than the working class. And I think that should be something that we should all agree on. I would also push for some sort of way to provide a minimum wage that actually could provide some sort of standard of living. And again, I understand the whole dynamics of the reasons why you think that's an insane idea, but I think that as a government leader, I should be trying to figure it out. If I was in some sort of educational leadership position, I would be pushing with all of my might to actually get a program set to where individuals can learn about interest rates and credit cards and banking and financial programs and savings accounts and retirements and I would really be pushing to actually discuss these economic models. I don't think it's right that what Adam Smith is saying has been manipulated and propagandized so far that people attack it and they don't know what it's even saying. One of the things that Adam Smith says in The Wealth of Nations is what you have to do to be able to combat the evils of capitalism is to have an educated society. And that way it balances it out. The society can recognize when capitalism has gone too far in whatever direction, and it can keep the guardrails on it in itself. And what we have done is everything in our power to remove the creative mind of the American and just shove consumerism inside of it. But what I was ultimately going to get to was if I was in a leadership position of our country, if I was the president of the United States, one of the main things I would be doing is seeing if there is any reason to be able or any way to be able to bring back any sort of value back into the dollar. Then what I would be doing is also seeing if there is any way to be able to fix our national debt. After that, I would really be trying to implement hope back into our country by bringing unity, by going out and giving as many speeches as I possibly could. But the most important thing that I would do is I would bring back fireside chats. I personally think that was one of the most important things that happened throughout the Great Depression. And by doing that, I would try to find a way to bring us all into one unified spot. And hopefully, I will have had a track record of leading with integrity and honesty and a strong moral framework to where people can actually listen. And what, of course, I recognized while I was imagining doing this kind of conclusion, which I guess I kind of just did, was that it just isn't real. I'm not in those leadership positions. And frankly, I don't think that any of our leaders are trying to do that because nobody thinks about the average person. And so with that, the reality is that, while I might not be the president of the United States, I have a fireside chat going right here. I come on Monday, or I release my videos on Tuesday, and I pour everything out that I have that I could possibly do to give you some sort of information. I think that it's really disappointing that we talk about capitalism and minimum wage and all of these different things as if like that's what matters. What matters is people. What matters is you. And if you're struggling, if 60% of Americans cannot afford the basic cost of living, that's an issue. There are a lot of people that are severely struggling and they don't know where to turn. And the issue is that I can't just hand you, here's a solution. But the thing that I can do, and I think the thing that I'm really recognizing, it might be the most important thing about my channel, is that I consistently say, I see you, and I'm sorry that you're experiencing this. And while I might not be able to reach out a hand to pull you out, I can at least reach out my hand to just say, hey, I'm here with you too. And my background is in banking, and I almost got fired because I spoke up to the district manager and said, I am not going to be promoting credit cards with credit card interest rates this high. It isn't right. And he said, it isn't up to you to make that decision. Well, I still didn't do it. And then I left and I started the channel. But you know, I since I was young, all I have wanted to do is to relieve the suffering of the person across from me. And I don't know if that's some sort of childhood trauma or if that's just the fundamentals inside of me, but I just cannot stand watching people get exploited. And I don't like people being in pain and suffering. And so, you know, it means a lot that I get so much emails and so many comments of people saying, thank you for having me not feel alone. And so I just want to conclude this with saying that you're not alone, that there are a lot of people experiencing similar things to you. And I'm doing the best that I can to get to that leadership position at some point. One of the things that I tell all of my friends, and I think it's important that you know, I don't want to be a YouTuber. I do not want to be an influencer. None of this interests me. I want to provide value. And I think at this moment, YouTube is the best place for me to be able to do so. But at some point, all of this, I just think of each video, each script, each 70-hour work week, each time I'm done editing at 4 in the morning to wake up at 7 in the morning so I can, do whatever else I have to do for the videos. I think this is one step closer to me to being able to actually make a change. And I think that we need that. I think that we need a new wave of leaders. And it might not be me, but I'm going to put my best foot forward each and every day and trying to get there. So that's kind of what I have to say on that. And I hope that it helps ignite something within you, hopefully something positive. And, you know, lastly, all I'll ask for is if you please don't mind just checking to see if you are subscribed. I continuously have to keep mentioning what's going on with that. But if this is providing value to you and you enjoy the content, if you don't mind just checking on that for me, please, I greatly appreciate it. Beyond that, I hope that you enjoyed this video. I know that you'll probably be thinking, why didn't you talk about socialism, communism? There's a lot more to discuss about capitalism. I'm trying to find ways to fund actually a 3-part series that is like a multi-hour for each series about capitalism, socialism, communism. And what I might have to do is just keep releasing little videos as I go. But again, just things that I'm trying to figure out. So this is just the first video of many. I hope that you're doing well. Until next time, bye-bye.